So let's talk some genetics, and we're going to focus on three major areas. Okay, there are more, trust me, but we're just going to look at the three that I think are probably the most common question that we hear for this particular issue. The first one is, did humans and chimps share a common ancestor? Now we'll spend the most time there because that's the one that we hear probably the most often. It's the one that's taught in schools, it's in the media, so we need to address that. Then we're going to talk about mitochondrial Eve. She is the evolutionary human female ancestor of us all. They say she lived about 100,000 or so years ago. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to answer the question is, was the initial human population composed of 10,000 individuals? That's what the evolutionists believed. It started off with 10,000. So really, we're asking three basic questions. We're asking who. Okay, who did we all descend from? Was it a common ancestor with the apes, or was it just humans, Adam and Eve? When did this mitochondrial Eve live? Was it really hundreds of thousands of years ago, or was it just 6,000 with the Eve of the Bible? And how many were there? Were there 10,000 people like the evolutionists say, or just two like the Bible says? So those are the three questions: who, when, and how many. So let's talk about, did humans and chimps have a common ancestor? So we're asking who. Now, Peter Enns, again, of Eastern University and BioLogos writes, the Human Genome Project completed in 2003 has shown beyond any reasonable scientific doubt that humans and primates share a common ancestry. So there's no doubt about it, humans and chimps are related. If you look at the DNA, it's a definite. Now, here's what I always start off with. What does the Bible say? Okay, first of all, what does the Bible say on this? And the Bible says that can't be true, what he just said, because we know that God created animals according to their kind, okay, and then God created man. And man was unique. Man was not evolved from the apes. Man was made in the image of God. So clearly from a biblical standpoint, we can say humans and chimps are not related. Now, because the Bible is true, when we look at the scientific evidence, it should confirm it. It should support it because it's the inerrant, infallible word of God, right? And it does. So let's take a look at that. And we're going to look at two areas kind of within this issue. And the first one is the genome similarity. So the genome is the DNA inside the nucleus of the cells. It has been sequenced for humans. It has been sequenced for chimps. So we can look at it and compare it. Now, most of you have probably heard that human and chimp DNA are 98 to 99% the same. Okay, that is the canard I hear all the time in the media. And the question is that really true? And for many years now, evolutionists actually have been saying no. And so in 2000, just to give you one example, this is a 2012 paper by evolutionists that said it is now clear that the genetic differences between humans and chimps are far more extensive than previously thought. Their genomes are not 98 or 99% identical. Now, I'm guessing you haven't heard anything probably about this in the media, because I haven't, right? And you probably won't, because I hate to break this to you, but the media, for the most part, is extremely liberal. And probably all of you already are aware of that. And so they have a certain agenda, most of them, again, not all of them, but they have an agenda, and they want you to believe that you are your own God, right? That you are evolved from nape. And so they're going to continue to espouse those views, even though they're not really scientific, and even the evolutionists wouldn't say that. Now, a creation geneticist, okay, someone who does believe in the biblical account of origins, by the name of Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins at the Institute for Creation Research, has been doing extensive analysis of human and chimp DNA. He's got some major supercomputers there. He's been plugging this information in. And I want to share with you some of his original research. But before I do that, I want to share with you what he found when he evaluated the human-chimp DNA comparisons that have already been done by the evolutionists. He said what he noticed was a lot of preferential and selective treatment of the data, okay? And so they're not really giving you the whole story, so to speak. So for example, he found that in some of the papers where they did comparison, they just use sequences that they expect to be similar, like the genes. So here's the problem with that. I would expect our genes to be similar, okay? Genes are what produce proteins, and proteins are what make up our bodies and do all the work in our bodies for the most part. So because chimps are mammals, and so are we, from a biological perspective, of course our genes are going to be similar. Our bodies have to do similar things. If you compare our genes to a dog, a cat, or a mouse, they would also be very similar. But that's not really giving us the big picture, right, of how much similarity there is. Humans, only 2% of our DNA codes for protein. So that's just looking at a very, very small portion of the DNA. It doesn't really give us the big picture. So now what's interesting is they found that when they do compare all of the DNA, that it turns out some of the differences, they just don't count. So for example, they're not counting non-aligned DNA, they're not counting gaps, they're not counting copy number variations, and they're not counting size differences. Now, these are legitimate differences between the human and chimp DNA. So why don't they count them? Because they have no idea what to do with these numbers. Because if all of these differences are true, right, and true differences between humans and chimps, there's not enough evolutionary time for that to have happened. See, they proposed that we had an evolutionary ancestor so many millions of years ago that we shared with the apes. All right, so if all of these differences are true, that means they're going to have to give even more time, more millions of years, and then the data is not going to match up with fossil data or radiometric dating data. That's going to be a problem, and all those things have to mesh and come together to tell the same story. So it really messes up their evolutionary timeline. While millions of years might seem like a lot of time to you, in evolutionary terms, that's a blip, okay? It's very, very small. And so to get that many differences, you're going to have more time, and they just simply don't have it. No evolutionary geneticist in their right mind would think that this many differences, so to speak, occurred in that amount of time. And so they know it's impossible. So they kind of ignore it. They don't count it. Now, is that a legitimate thing to do? Well, absolutely not. You can't say, well, those differences aren't important, because you don't know that from an experimental basis. Some of them might say, well, it's just in the junk DNA, okay? It's in the DNA that isn't important. That's the DNA in between the genes. That's 98% of our DNA. It's termed junk. Now, that's a whole other talk I have, by the way. But as it turns out, junk DNA isn't junk, okay? It has a function. It's doing something. So to say, well, those differences are in DNA that isn't important, there's no such thing, okay? All of the DNA is important. All of it's doing something. Almost all of it's functional. So it's going to become an increasing problem for their argument. Now, as it turns out, what they really do count to get that 98 to 99% similarity is they're really only counting one type of difference, all right? So let me show you what they're counting. So when we write DNA, when we write it out, we use 4 letters, A, C, T, and G, that are the 4 bases of DNA. And what we find happening is that in regions that are very, very similar, which are called the alignment regions, there are places where there is human DNA, which we'll say is the top line here, and chimp DNA, which is the bottom line here, but they're not the same. Okay, so those are the only differences they count. Now you can see there's a difference here, right? There's a gap. There's another gap here. This is what they would call non-aligned DNA that doesn't match up. Okay, so why aren't you counting those differences, right? But so that's clearly a problem. And again, it doesn't fit their evolutionary story, so they don't count it. In my opinion, this is very bad science, and it's very deceptive science, because it's not really giving you the true story of what's going on. So what's the reality? Okay, how many differences are there really between human and chimp genome? And Dr. Tompkins recently published a paper on this, and he found that there's probably only about 88% similarity overall. Now, that might sound like, well, that's still a lot of similarity, but you got to consider that's a 12% difference, which 12% of 3 billion, you're talking 360 million differences. That's a lot. Okay, a lot of differences. And no geneticist, again, in their right mind, is going to believe that that many differences occurred in that many millions of years. I'm also giving them, for the sake of argument, that mutations do what they need them to do, okay, so that the changes in DNA can lead from one kind of organism to a completely different kind of organism. As it turns out, mutations don't do that, okay? So even if they could have all these differences, it wouldn't matter, because mutations just don't do that, okay? We can observe that, and we can see that that doesn't happen. So their argument fails on many, many levels. Now, this does not count, this 88% figure does not count the fact that chimps have an 8% larger genome than human beings. So if you count that in, then there's only about an 80% similarity. And this doesn't count the fact that you're just talking about the linear sequence of DNA, the string of bases, so to speak. DNA is a 3-dimensional structure, and we're still figuring out all the layers of information that are there. For example, epigenetics. That's an area of genetics where they look at the chemical markers on DNA that affect what we call the expression of DNA. It's very different between humans and chimps. So this is a very conservative number. The reality is it's probably much lower than this as we continue to figure out how the information is encoded in the DNA. So there's no way to account for this many differences in the evolutionary time frame, leading Dr. Tompkins to conclude that this defies standard evolutionary timescales and dogmatic presuppositions about a common ancestor. There's just no way. There's too many differences. Now, the other part of this that we want to talk about is something called chromosome fusion. Now, I want to tell you a few facts, and then I'm going to tell you the evolutionary story to account for these facts. So, it is a fact that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and it is a fact that chimps have 24. Okay, so there's a difference. Now, if we came from a common ancestor, why do we have 23 and chimps have 24? They have to account for that somehow. Now, when they did initial studies of human DNA, this is before sequencing was really common and really quick, they would stain the DNA, the chromosomes, and they could see what are called banding patterns. And they noticed the human chromosome 2 was very similar to chimp chromosomes 12 and 13. And so just to show you that, so this is the real staining here, okay, the real chromosomes, and then they show it to you in a figure form. So human chromosome 2, they said, it's very similar to these two chromosomes, 12 and 13. All right, so they developed a story based off of that, and that story was, well, there must have been a fusion that occurred in the line leading to humans of two of those chromosomes, such so that we have 23 and chimps have 24. So here's how the story goes. In a common ancestor, there were 24 pairs of chromosomes. After they diverged, okay, so humans are going down this path to become humans, chimps are going down this path to become chimps, there was a fusion in the human line. Okay, two chromosomes fused together, so therefore humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and since all humans come from them, all humans have 23. In the chimp line, that fusion did not occur. So just like the ancestor, they have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Since all chimps come from them, they have 24, all chimps have 24 pairs of chromosomes. Now, this is not based on any evidential experience. This is just a story that they had to develop to explain this. It's not like you can go in the fossils and find this, okay? That's not reality. So this is just the story they've developed to explain it. And they would even go so far, some of them, as to say, it is definitive proof that humans and chimps shared a common ancestor. Now, here's the thing. In science, we don't use the term definitive proof. If you're going to use that, it's called a law. And, you need to have a lot of things backing that up, backing that statement up, because that is a very strong statement. And I want to share with you just some quotes from a few theistic evolutionists, again, professing Christians, but they believe in evolution in millions of years to kind of show that. The first is from Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the NIH. He said, the fusion that occurred as we evolved from the apes has left its DNA imprint here. It is very difficult to understand this observation without postulating a common ancestor. He said, how is it that human chromosome 2 looks so similar to chimps chromosomes 12 and 13 unless there was a fusion that occurred? I mean, how else can you explain that, is basically what he's saying. This next quote comes from Ken Miller, and he's a molecular biologist and theistic evolutionist, and he said, you know what? If we don't find a fused chromosome in humans, evolution is wrong. We don't share a common ancestor. Whoa. Okay, so you're willing to bet it all on one piece of evidence. And so, and what's interesting is this quote comes from a YouTube video that someone posted of his lecture, and they labeled it How to Shut Up Pesky Creationists. It has been viewed nearly 2 million times. Okay, so this is a very common thing that people will use to, so to speak, to say that, we're wrong, chimps and humans definitely had a common ancestor. Now, although he says this, and he's made this statement actually several times, that he'd be willing to change his mind, basically, if it could be shown otherwise, I don't believe it. Because I can show that human chromosome 2 is not the result of a fusion. He has been presented with that evidence, and he has not changed his mind. Why? Because this isn't about the evidence. Okay, the evidence is clear. It's about a worldview, and not wanting to change that worldview, even in spite of the obvious, okay, wanting to cling to that. So let me summarize here what their supposed proof of evolution is. So or that we shared a common ancestor with the apes. So again, chromosomes 12 and 13 were in the ancestor, okay? And in the line leading to humans, a fusion occurred, and so now we have one that's known as chromosome 2 in human. This has gone so far, so to speak, that in chimps, they don't have chromosomes 12 and 13 anymore. They relabeled them 2A and 2B to represent the fact that they think it's a fusion that occurred in the human line. That's how strong this belief is. Now, if a fusion had occurred, what would we expect to see? There should be telltale signs of that. So you see these little dark blue caps on the ends of the chromosomes. Those are called telomeres. They're certain sequences of DNA. It kind of repeats itself over and over again. They serve as end caps to kind of protect the DNA. And interestingly enough, one of their jobs is to prevent fusion. So I'm kind of struggling how they were involved in a fusion when that's one of their jobs is to prevent it. So we should see a bunch of telomere sequences right there. The other thing is this little red symbolic square here, that's a centromere. Every chromosome has one centromere. And it's important when the cells are dividing and the DNA material needs to be divided up between the two cells. There are certain sequences associated with those. So we should see one in the fused chromosome. It's not active anymore, but it should be there along with the real one. So that's what we should see. So we can sequence human chromosome 2, and we can look for those things. And that's what they've done. And so what did they find? Well, they're having trouble finding a lot of those telomeres in the middle. There's some sequences there that are sort of kind of like telomeres, but not nearly in the number they should be, okay, if they're truly telomeres. So that's a problem, okay? The telomere sequences, even the evolutionists would admit that it's very, very degenerate. And they kind of scratch their heads like, well, why is it so degenerate? Why aren't there more telomere sequences here? Because it's not a fusion. That's why. There shouldn't be any telomeres there because it's not two chromosomes that have fused together. Then they looked for that centromere, that other centromere that should be there, and they can't really find it. There's some sequences there that sometimes are associated with centromeres, but they're certainly not unique to centromeres. We find them in other places. So that's a problem as well. That other inactivated centromere isn't there. Now, there's many other lines of evidence that Dr. Tompkins has developed to show that it's just doesn't look like a fused chromosome. It doesn't match up with chromosomes 12 and 13. And one of them that he found, and he's published on this, and you'll see the reference in the next slide, is he found a gene there, okay, that spans the fusion site. Genes are always found on just one chromosome. I mean, it's not part of the genes here on this chromosome and part of the genes over here on this chromosome, okay? That doesn't happen. The gene's always on one chromosome. So how could it be that you somehow had parts of it on both and then they fused together and now those parts are together? That's just not realistic. So here's the supposed fusion site and here's the gene, right? Part of it's on one side and part of it's on the other side. The other thing is telomeres don't occur in the middle of genes. I mean, genes aren't around telomeres. So that it's just filled with a lot of problems. And the conclusion is the human chromosome 2 is not the result of a fusion. It just doesn't match up sequence-wise with chimp chromosomes 12 and 13. So therefore, it cannot support common ancestry for humans and chimps. So in summary, humans and chimps have DNA similarity. Nobody doubts that. Of course, we're both mammals, so we would expect that. But claims of extremely high levels of similarity are patently false. Methods are highly prejudiced to favor that similarity. Like we said, they only look at the genes. They don't count certain differences. Or they made conclusions before adequate research was completed. So just looking at bands is not enough. You have to look at the actual sequence. So therefore, human genetic comparisons just don't support common ancestry. All right, the next question we're going to ask, when did mitochondrial Eve live more than 100,000 years ago? Now, supposedly all humans can be traced back to this woman who was one of about 10,000 people alive at that time who lived between 100 and 200,000 years ago. Okay, so this is very different, obviously, from the biblical account of Adam and Eve. Now, biblically, again, we can say that's not right because we know that God only created Adam and Eve. They were the only two people. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And we know from the biblical genealogies that this occurred, that they were created only about 6,000 years ago, not hundreds of thousands of years ago. Now, again, because the Bible is true, when we look at the scientific evidence, it should be consistent with that and support that, and indeed it does. Now, let me explain, first of all, what mitochondrial DNA is. So in your cell, we've been talking mainly about the DNA that's in here, in the nucleus. But you also have DNA in structures called mitochondria. And those are the energy factories of the cell. Okay, they produce energy. And they have a small circular piece of DNA that's approximately 16,000 bases in length. So it's much smaller than the 3 billion that's in your nucleus. And you only inherit it from your mother, okay, because it's in the egg. The sperm does not contribute mitochondrial DNA. So it's used to trace maternal lineages. Right? If you wanted to do paternal, you'd look at the Y chromosome, because only guys have a Y chromosome. So as it turns out, all human beings have very similar mitochondrial DNA. Wonder why, okay? So like my daughter, for example, we adopted her from China, so I'm not her biological mother. But if we compared our mitochondrial DNA, it would actually look very, very similar. Even though she's of a different ethnic group than I am, they would be very, very similar. Okay, so here's just kind of a slide showing what's going on here. So we have this couple, okay, this represents their mitochondrial DNA. Again, it only gets passed from mom. So they have a daughter, she passes it to her. They have a daughter, she passes it to her, and so on. Now this couple up here, they had a son, right? And she'll pass her mitochondrial DNA to him, but he won't pass it to his daughter, okay? So it's only on the maternal line. And so even the evolutionists would agree that mitochondrial DNA is pretty similar. And so they would say, though, that she lived around 100,000 years ago. But here's where it gets really interesting, because they can't seem to agree on exactly when she lived. So just looking at the past few years, papers that have been published on this, in 2009, she was 108,000 years old. In 2012, she got really old. She jumped to 250 to 300,000 years old. And in 2013, she was 157,000 years old. So which is it? Okay, because it keeps changing. Why does it keep changing? Because they're all making certain assumptions about the past. They weren't there, they don't know. So they plug those assumptions in, and they keep getting different answers as a result of that. Okay, they keep having, because they have differing assumption. The one assumption, though, that remains the same for all of these dates is that they've assumed humans and chimps have a common ancestor. So here's the issue. This is why they're getting such elevated timelines, is because human and chimp mitochondrial DNA is very different. And so when you count that into your calculation, well, yeah, you figure you got more changes, more differences, you have to have more time, right? So it balloons it up, it elevates it because of that. Now, in 1997, however, there was a paper published by evolutionary scientists that said the date for mitochondrial Eve was 6,500 years ago. Okay, that's really close to the biblical time frame, right? So when you look at the paper and you see, okay, so how did they do this? It turns out they only compared humans to humans. So they looked at, for example, the mitochondrial DNA of a great-grandmother, a grandmother, a mother, a daughter, a granddaughter, a great-granddaughter. They only compared human DNA to human DNA. They did not assume human chimp ancestry, and lo and behold, they get the biblical time frame. That's because all humans are related to each other, okay? We're not related to the chimps. So when you don't have them as part of the equation, you get a realistic and a biblical time frame. Now, the people that published this paper were very shocked at their findings, and there was a huge outcry from the evolutionary community when this was published, because it isn't right? According to their story, it's a major problem. So the people that published the paper said, using our empirical data to calibrate the mitochondrial DNA molecular clock would result in an age of mitochondrial Eve of only 6,500 years ago, clearly incompatible with the known age of modern humans. Like, it can't be right? Because it doesn't match our evolutionary time frame, so we're just going to ignore it. And they come up with all kinds of rescuing devices, right, to try to make it work. But the fact is staring them in the face that it's a major, major problem when you don't assume that human-chimp ancestry. You don't get the date that they would expect. Now, it's really interesting because Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, who is a geneticist here at Answers in Genesis, he's been looking at mitochondrial DNA sequences. They're in databases. You can compare them from humans all over the world. And what he found is that what we observe with the mitochondrial DNA is absolutely consistent with the biblical time frame and absolutely inconsistent with an evolutionary one. So here's what he found. He said, okay, so if she's 157,000 years old, like the evolutionists say, at least their most recent paper on this, if we use that figure, on average, we know the mitochondrial mutation rate. So on average, there should be about 1,000 differences that we find in mitochondrial DNA, okay, among humans, about 1,000 differences. If she's only 6,000 years old, like the biblical time frame, we should on average only see about 20 to 79 differences because it's less time, right? So less differences. And so he looked at that because he looked at human mitochondrial DNA sequences and databases from people all over the world. And lo and behold, what you observe is on average, there are 77 differences. What is that consistent with? Absolutely consistent with the biblical time frame, and by orders of magnitude inconsistent with an evolutionary one. He's even shown this for several animals as well, the exact same thing. There's no way, when you look at the DNA, it is so stinking similar. There's just not that many differences. It doesn't even matter what people group you are. We just don't see that many differences. And that's exactly what we would expect within the biblical time frame that we have of only 6,000 years. So in summary, the male and female ancestor of us all, the biblical Adam and Eve, we know they lived very recently. We know that from the biblical genealogies and chronologies. We know that was about 6,000 years ago. Mitochondrial DNA analysis is absolutely consistent with that. So evolutionists have a lot of explaining to do with this because it just doesn't match their ideas of the time frame. And even if you look at different people groups, now notice I don't use the term races because there are not multiple races of people. We all come from Adam and Eve, so we are the human race. There are different ethnic groups, okay, different people groups, but we all kind of diverged out. Those kind of started after the Tower of Babel. So it's only been about 4,000 years ago or so since that. So of course there's just not that many differences because it's just not that much time has passed.